is this a weird house of cards? Or is it just like this is just another evolution of Magic where now you're reliant upon content creators who are helping to sculpt the culture, right? You're reliant upon players buying into this idea of Rule Zero and continuing to operate on the fact that if the game doesn't go very well and it's bad, that they're the ones who messed up, right? Not that the game is bad. And then you're also relying upon outside intellectual property in a way that Magic has never done before.
Distraction makers.
We're going to talk about how casual players took over Magic the Gathering, or I should say, maybe assumed their
rightful role,
their rightful reign over Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
Considering that casual players were the majority of the player base the entire time the Magic has been in existence.
I was going to say, if we're looking at this like the popular vote, they should have won a long time ago.
Right. Yeah. And the question is whether or not that's the right thing for the game, which, we'll probably just say that now. We don't know, right?
Yeah. Do we embrace our casual overlords? Right. I don't know. It's allowed me to make sillier decks.
We're going to talk about where we are, how we got here, and then maybe what comes next.
Where we are now, you have been using a term lately called strategic collapse.
Yeah. It's from Characteristics of Games.
This book?
Yeah, this one.
This one right
that one
here?
Right there. So first, let's define what strategic collapse is.
Whoa, it's right here.
Wow, crazy.
I'm on the page. I'm going to read a little passage here from Characteristics of Games. A lack of balance can be thought of as a problem with the complexity tree of a game. The bushiness of the tree is much less than intended because a small number of strategies are much better than the others. Phrased another way, the game seems to be offering a large number of interesting choices, but on closer examination, it turns out only a few of them are viable, so the fun of the game is not realized. Players just use those choices again and again. The heuristics of the game have been reduced from the potentially rich and satisfying collection that might have existed to a very simple heuristic: play only with the much better strategies.
So effectively, your game's making a promise of this game is deep and has lots of different ways to play it and lots of different decks or whatever you can play. And then when you actually come down to it, there's like one deck, or there's one deck and then there's one deck specifically designed to just beat that one other deck. Basically, it's this idea that when cards become too powerful, you are much better off being proactive and being the one presenting win conditions rather than being the one who is countering the win conditions of the other player. Because if you're the one countering, you are using up your resources to stop them, but not moving yourself towards victory. And so what ends up happening in Magic systems is that as power creep has sort of taken over the game, and there's no way to sort of rotate these cards out because these are eternal formats, presenting a win condition becomes so easy that there's almost no reason to interact with your opponent at all, right? You basically present a win condition, you use counterspells proactively, and if they stop you still, right, because it's like you play your thing, they play a counterspell, you play another counterspell, you win the game. And then if you don't do that, you just present another win attempt. Your counterspells are much more powerful proactively than your opponents are reactively in a defensive use, because your counterspell, if it succeeds, wins the game. If their counterspell succeeds, the game just doesn't end, right? It's
right.
that now we're sort of back at parity. This is a consequence of particularly powerful cards, cards that make it particularly easy to win the game, right? Splinter Twin being just sort of one of the best examples from the past. You put these two cards together in combination, you win the game. Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. That's sort of explaining the situation of strategic collapse. Okay, so let's then look at Commander for a minute, because that's specifically what we're talking about, because that's sort of the format that has taken over Magic in, as the casual premier format. And when we look at CEDH, we can see that it effectively is in strategic collapse, right? It comes down to you're much more likely to win the game if you're in seat 1. There's a handful of decks that are viable, 2, maybe 3. And that's just sort of like what everybody is doing when they're playing the game at this point, when they're playing CEDH. So the question then becomes, does it even matter?
So some of this is a little weird because CEDH, obviously there's more interest in it as of late. There's a lot more talk about it, a lot of drama about it. But I think really a lot of it is people are trying to figure out what this format looks like at a competitive level. Wizards not officially sanctioning or supporting CEDH necessarily, or even really totally acknowledging it, means that they're kind of leaving it up to the players. And instead, they're really embracing this sort of casual format of Commander. We've talked a lot on this channel about how Commander, as much as we can say it's casual, its systems do not support casual play necessarily.
Right. It is not an inherently casual system. The thing that makes... There's two things that make Commander casual. One is rule zero conversations. Two is politics. And once politics has sort of overridden the systems of the game, those systems don't matter as much, and you're just playing the politics game.
So where we are currently is essentially Commander as the casual format is being the primary supported format. We're seeing less and less official support that Wizard seems to be showing for some of its higher tournaments or more traditional tournaments like Standard. It seems like there's maybe a little bit more attention to things like Modern. I think Mark Rosewater even said Modern is actually their second most played format.
I wonder how far in second place it is.
I'm very curious about that. But now we're seeing a sort of decline in interest in this competitive play of Magic and an increase in interest in these sort of casual get-togethers like Magicons.
Yeah, and it's really telling too when the peak of competitive Magic tournaments happened in like 2015, and it was like about 7,500 people at one tournament. And then Magic Cons, generally speaking, have somewhere around 10,000 attendees already, and they sort of have just started getting kicked off.
I think Vegas last year had 25,000.
Oh, well.
And it's supposed to be larger this year. So
never mind, much more than 10,000. So Magic Cons already are sort of like more successful than what competitive events ever were. Now, that's talking about people competing. There may have been more attendees, but there's not really any other reason to attend other than if being that you're competing.
And now MagicCon offers this whole other reason, right? Not only do you get, first look at all the newest stuff, but also there's just it's a lot more. It's embracing more of that casual play, right? Of that camaraderie that you get out of the community. And they still have the competitive formats and competitive play, but I don't think that's the primary reason that people usually go to those events anymore. So I think we have to go back and look at Magic's origins to see like exactly how we sort of escalated up to this point, right?
Yeah.
Because Magic sort of started technically in a more casual state, and that it was never really intended. It was always intended to have constructed play, but the original intention was never to have constructed play at such an optimized level that it was going to be like tournaments, like what we have now. And they had to quickly adapt after it came out and was obviously a huge success to try and create a tournament format, right? We started seeing card limitations, so it wasn't just as many cards as you want. You had to start having 4 copies as a cap. And they started actually having proper structures to their rules and tournament rules.
I don't know if this was exactly spearheaded by Scaphalias, but he definitely had a substantial impact on the organized play side of Magic the Gathering early on. But this was something that like separated Magic from the competition, right? From other TCGs at the time. Magic was always sort of looked up to as like the card game that had the most sort of competitive integrity. Competitors being Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, where like they also had competitive scenes. There were people playing it competitively, but by and large, Magic sort of was the card game that was like seen as the top tier competitive game. And part of the reason why is because the incentives of Magic were such that they didn't have anything else to rely on besides being the best game it possibly could be, right? When we look at competitors like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, they had other means to sort of market their games to their customers, right? Pokemon has the games and the TV show. Yu-Gi-Oh has the TV show. And so Magic's just Magic. It's just the game.
They could have just come out with Magic, and the novelty of it being the first trading card game would have actually been enough to probably carry it pretty far. But I think that would have been an ultimately short-sighted view of the potential goal. So the fact that Magic came out and they were able to create the structure that was solid enough for it to be this very competitive game, I think it just shows how good of a game it is. On top of that, I think Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh also leaned their sort of demographics and audience into a younger audience that was a little bit more lenient towards this sort of more structured competitive play. And a lot of people instead were more okay with they'll buy a few packs here and there and, maybe play, maybe not play.
There was still a huge swath of casual players of Magic, right? That were just sort of a bit unseen by Wizards at the time, right? It was the visible players were the ones playing in these tournaments. They were the ones that could collect data on. They could judge how well the metagame was doing based on these players. And so we had a pretty long period of time. I mean, we're talking like 20 plus years of that sort of being Magic's focus. In the background, we had these players that were sort of disenfranchised from that mode of play. I remember very clearly that, I worked at a local game store for a period of time, and I remember there being players that were almost staunchly anti-competitive, right? But they didn't really have a format to land in. The store ran leagues, which are just sort of like casual play, and you get points just for playing. And then they had like Friday Night Magic, which is a competitive tournament environment. And so those two players were a little bit at odds, right? You didn't have a lot of players that would play in the leagues that would also play in the Friday Night Magic. And I remember when Commander started showing up at that time, Elder Dragon Highlander, whatever, but like it sort of caught on in our area, and suddenly all of the casual players were playing that. And I do wonder how much of its sort of grassroots marketing that happened for Commander was one that was in opposition to the competitiveness that was happening, right? Because clearly stated, as Sheldon and other people that had worked on early Commander, was that their goal to give a place for cards to be played that were not being played in the other formats.
I can see how that could make the connection of that must inherently be casual.
That must inherently be casual then, but I don't think it. I don't know.
That's not totally true.
Right? Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of different factors as to why this could grow. I think that's something that ends up happening with games, especially games that are eternal, right? Magic has a rotating format, but it in itself, getting these game pieces, collecting them, eternalizes the game, right? And I think as more and more people get these game pieces, they've invested more and more money, they eventually want to kind of hop off that treadmill, right, of the competitive rotating formats, but they still want to play the game that they really like. And so they want to feel like they can dip their toe into playing the game when they want. And what ends up happening is that there's this sort of long chain that just is bloat that adds more and more and more. And every single year that adds, there's more players that are like, oh, well, I would want to play this game, but there's so many things that have come out. Like, I just can't keep up. And as that has gone on, I think the amount of players that feel that way have just grown. And to the point that when there is now this sort of format, that was this eternalized format, it was very casual with all of the politicking, and more people could play with all their friends. So it meant that, you could just play with two people if you wanted, I suppose, but you can play with even more people if you all want to get together in that way. It meant that you could go and put your pile of cards that you've collected sporadically over the years together, and you can still play the game that you really want to play. And I think as soon as Wizards officially supported that, it seems like maybe there was some sort of like a boiling point, right? That all those players suddenly were like, as those years grew on, all those players that fell off then suddenly were like, oh, I can come back now.
There was like a schism in the player base that was already there, that like it feels like that player base suddenly was seen, right? Like, oh, here's your casual format, right? Even though like the systems themselves aren't inherently casual, other than sort of the politics side of it. But again, that's not the systems itself. That's something that overrides them. The other part of Commander that is, I guess, sort of inherently interesting and attractive to, I think, casual players is the idea of Rule Zero. And Rule Zero is like not something that Commander specifically came up with, but like that incarnation of it and sort of trying to facilitate it in that way and acknowledge it and say that this is really like part of the rules of the game. I think in other instances, it's something that sort of happens emergently, right? Like, let's say you're having a poker night or whatever. You might all decide, hey, we want, twos to be wild, right? We want we want to play more casual poker. So if you have a two, it counts as any card.
Yeah, this used to just be, it was house rules, right? It's anyone that plays games at some point decides, oh, I don't like how this game plays, so I'm going to, what if we played it this way, right? That's just Rule Zero.
In that instance, though, like you're creating a Rule Zero in like a poker setting, it applies evenly to all players, right? If like twos are wild, then it's like, okay, well, all twos in the deck are wild. Any player has an equal chance to draw those twos. But when we start to move into like Magic territory, we have customizable decks that don't necessarily line up in that way, right? And so if you are bringing your own rule set, which is your deck already, right? And then you're adding in an additional rule set outside of that game system to then there's sort of a perverse incentive, right, to manipulate the rules in your favor without maybe even knowing that you're doing it, by saying like, well, this is the way I like to play, and the way I like to play happens to line up with the deck that I'm playing, and if you're not playing that way, then you're not doing the right thing.
Let's say you're at a table with a bunch of people that really like to play red and green in general as the colors, but there's one player that really likes blue, and everyone else at the table is like, well, we don't like blue, so you can't play blue. That's a very drastic Rule Zero. I'm sure there's not many people that do that. It's an exaggeration, but that's essentially kind of what's happening on a micro level, right? And if enough of those Rule Zeros happen, you're just limiting a lot of people's deck creativity and construction and the enjoyment that they get out of doing that. It's very similar to if you were to play poker, you have an asymmetry of rules, and you'd point at someone and say, you have to drop all twos from your hand.
Right, like you specifically,
you specifically have to do that.
Because you're just like better at poker than us, so you can't play twos.
Right.
But we all get twos wild.
Yeah.
Which, like, I don't know, maybe you could do that, I guess. And if everybody agrees to it,
if everyone agrees to it, then great. It's not an official rule, though.
Right. So, you know, when we're talking about this idea of sort of strategic collapse happening at the highest levels, if players, for whatever reason, are incentivized to play suboptimally, then you don't really have to worry about strategic collapse because they're not going to get to that point. And Rule Zero in this way is almost this perfect smokescreen a bit for unbalanced game pieces, because if you're not having a good time playing the game, it's sort of like put on the players to figure out what that good experience is, right? Okay, well, if for whatever reason this card is broken in your group, well, it just Rule Zeroed out. Don't worry about it. And so it takes this pressure off of Wizards of the Coast to make a particularly balanced game. When we're in this like hyper competitive environment, it's all on Wizards of the Coast to make sure that that environment is good, right? Like that is playable.
I think on Wizards' end, what do you measure success by? With designing any individual
sales,
card.
Right? Like,
and yeah, if it's measured by sales, then you're going to do whatever it takes to get sales. And maybe that's just power creeping like crazy. It's leaning into the collector culture as much as possible. That's a possibility. And as long as your players don't end up getting so upset that they completely leave, right, then technically Wizards is, from their point of view, in the clear. Now, that's certain people at Wizards, right? That's not the designers at Wizards. They obviously want to have sales as well, but they, I'm sure, want to have a good game.
Let's sort of put a cap on how we got here, right? And part of, like, again, Rule Zero leading into the sort of casual state for a player base that was there and established that Wizards knew was there, but did not necessarily know how to reach.
Right.
So the breakthrough was, we know how to reach those players now.
We've reached this new player base, which is good. I think that was probably an unexpected amount of a boost that they got. I'm sure Wizards could not have planned for not only this official supported format bringing in all these new players, but then content creators jumping on, and suddenly now there's tons of, free advertising essentially for it. That's like huge. But also, I think that as that audience has come in, Wizards still is trying to get more and more people into their game and grow it more into the sort of general mass audience pop culture place that they want it to be. And so I think they've started now borrowing from these other IPs essentially to try and get more and more of that audience to come on board.
As we said, the way that Magic was competing previously was that they were the premier competitive card game. And then now they've sort of seized an opportunity to move away from that, which takes some of the pressure off of being perfect on the design side, which in some ways is good. But you're now relying upon these smoke screens theoretically, and I'm saying smoke screen, and that feels a little inherently negative, but I'm not sure that it's inherently negative, because maybe this is sustainable and can last forever. But let's talk about the ecosystem in which Commander exists in, and what is propping it up now. In the marketplace, right? Like, how is Magic competing against other games now?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that if we compare it to, Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, neither of them really offer an official casual format. And in fact, I've been hearing more and more people from Yu-Gi-Oh side of things or other TCGs saying that they wish that they would get a format like Commander in their own game because they want to have something like this. They've also reached that point of bloat that there's a large amount of people that miss playing the game and want to participate in their own way without having to be on that constant grind of getting new things. So now Magic is actually sort of slotting into this new demographic, this new section that it's like people within their, 20s to 30s, maybe 40s, that don't want to play competitively anymore, but still want to occasionally have their own little Friday night Magic with their own friend group.
There's all these sort of forces keeping that are sort of the new systems of entropy, right? So it used to be that we needed a rotation cycle, right? Like standard rotation was how we were turning over the soil and getting a new competitive game. And if there were any sort of design mistakes that were in the environment, they would get moved out and then we'd get a refresh, right? And now with this eternal format, it's like you need new methods to make sure that players play suboptimally. Rule Zero being one of them. The other one being just the culture, right? The culture period is like, okay, well, this game is supposed to be casual, so stop trying to optimize it. If you look at it too long, you're going to notice that stuff's kind of broken, right? So,
well, that's not even what people say when they say.
Right.
It's just generally like, that's not the format.
That's not what you're supposed to do. And it's like, well, you can do whatever you want. That's kind of the point. Part of this new ecosystem for Magic includes content creators. And I think we'd sort of be remiss to not mention the fact that content creators are not playing the same game that players are playing.
What?
Yeah, which, look, to Game Night's credit, Command Zone's credit, they have come out and said, hey, we make a bunch of modifications to this. We're playing for the camera. We're playing for the audience. We're playing to make the games more fun and more dramatic so that we're making better entertainment, right? And in some ways, this is quite a bit similar to the Matt Mercer effect with D&D. Created unrealistic expectations for the majority of DMs playing D&D, and now D&D has I'm not saying this is like exactly why this happened, but D&D has a DM problem. Like there's not enough people that want to DM D&D as to how many players there are to play D&D. So I'm not saying Commander necessarily has exactly the same problem, because there's not that asymmetry that D&D has where you need somebody who's like, the DM who's running the thing. Commander runs on its own, but I will say that I think in the same way there's unrealistic expectations about the fun or the outcomes of these games that are supposed to happen, that are being shown constantly on these sort of, Commander gameplay channels, that are creating sort of unrealistic expectations for the game. And then in combination with Rule 0, you have a way to sort of obfuscate any kind of bad games that are happening, and the players put the blame on themselves instead of the game systems.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we've talked to at least a couple of content creators, right, in the space.
Oh yes, no, all of them do this.
And I think that it makes sense is that you don't want the content to be boring, right? And there's plenty of Commander games that have accidentally, right, off camera, just been super boring. So like you don't want to risk having everyone get together, spend their 3+ hours or whatever,
or 7.
record or 7 recording a game, and then that game just ends up being a dud. Right. So instead you need to make sure, and you're like, as you are a participant usually in that, you're always thinking like, what is the story, right? That you're telling as you're going through this game. And sometimes, you play something silly or suboptimal, or you don't play a particular thing because, you're like, well, we've been going for 2.5 hours. Do I really want to board wipe right now? Right? Like, is that really what I want to do? And maybe you do that in person too, if you're just like tired of it, I guess. But, that also sounds miserable.
There's also like nothing that's forcing that to happen, right? It's like it's either players are left to their own discretion to go like, what makes for the better story, the better game here? Let me sort of like put my finger on the scale of making this game better, right? Rather than the systems themselves doing it. Like it's weird. It's a weird place to be.
Yeah.
So there's one more sort of like, I guess I'll say system of entropy, or like reason why players might play suboptimally. And this brings in Universes Beyond. So we were talking earlier about the new Sephiroth card. We have a friend that was decided to switch her commander out for Sephiroth when she was playing Yawgmoth or something before. And we look at these two cards and we go, well, like Sephiroth is like fine, but Yawgmoth's probably the better card. But she's playing Sephiroth instead because it's Sephiroth.
We've talked about this before, I think in a video where we covered like different meta cycles or ways of rotating a meta or keeping it fresh, where like flavor can do that, right? Where flavor can support suboptimal play.
Oh yeah, it was literally the flavor is more than fluff video.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And it's that flavor essentially can create a sense of role play, right? Where I want to play suboptimally because I want to encapsulate this particular character or this theme or whatever, right? This is where you get your bracket 1 decks. And I think that that's perfectly fine. I think the only issue, though, is that if that's the metric, right, like that then becomes a sort of a metric of fun. You could have a metric of like theming or experience or whatever, but that's kind of up to the players. That's not necessarily something for Wizards to design, right? Unless they wanted to make an entire Sephiroth deck that is the most flavorful possible deck, even if it plays like garbage. Like,
right.
Technically, I guess you could do that, I suppose.
Watch, guys, I'm playing out the storyline of Final Fantasy VII right now. Here comes Sephiroth. Right. Oh, it's crazy. And like everybody's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Which like is fine if players want to do that, but when designing a game, that can't be the metric that you design around. Right.
You don't have any control over it. It's up to players or whether or not they want to do this or not.
You can technically design to make sure someone could play the Final Fantasy VII storyline, I suppose.
Yeah, you can.
You can design around that, but there's still a game to be played, right? And that game still has to be reaching its conclusions and it has to synergize and fit together.
And this kind of brings up the precarious situation that I'm curious to see how Magic navigates, right? Which is they're sort of becoming reliant on a lot of things that are outside of their control. And that's when I'm like, okay, like, is this a weird house of cards? Like, or is it just like, this is just another evolution of Magic where now you're reliant upon content creators who are helping to sculpt the culture, right? You're reliant upon players buying into this idea of rule zero and continuing to operate on the fact that if the game doesn't go very well and it's bad, that they're the ones who messed up, right? Not that the game is bad. And then you're also relying upon outside intellectual property in a way that Magic has never done before, where you have these other games like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! That had this outside IP that they were built on, and Magic wasn't, right? And I think that was a strength of Magic. And so now you're sort of reliant on these things, again, that are outside of your control to maintain your systems of entropy, right? And keeping players playing suboptimally. Does it work? We'll see, I guess. We don't know.
I mean, obviously it's worked financially for them, right? This is the
in
most
the short term
lucrative that Wizards has been. Yeah, we'll see if Universes Beyond can keep up and if its impact on Standard and other formats are going to, dwindle anyone's interest. Be very interesting, but I think that we're already starting to see the cracks form a little bit. Not necessarily with Universe Beyond, but I think when we see like how they've been handling some of the bans lately, and the bracket system in general, is that a lot of the conversations around the cards used in the bracket 3 or the Game Changers list, as well as cards that were banned / unbanned, it's been a very loose sort of a structure that they're going off of, where some cards make sense, and some cards it seems to have like this sort of logical reason as to why they have it, and then other cards are a little bit more of like, it sounds like that would just be not fun, and like maybe, I guess, but it used to be something was not fun because it was lantern control. Now
it was too good, or it just
right,
took over the whole format and like it had a huge percentage of the metagame, and like it was clear that we have statistical data saying, hey, this is a problem.
Right. Or like Nadu was the recent most not fun, right? And that's just long play of non-deterministic outcomes, right? And now not fun can just be, well, someone discarded a lot of cards, right? Or someone, they took my cards because Turgid, right? Like, and it's not a very clear indicator of direction.
Seems Magic is kind of hellbent on, I don't know if hellbent's the right word. Magic is fine, hellbent, since that's a Magic reference anyway.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they got no cards in their hand?
They got no cards in their hand.
Okay.
They're hellbent on sort of becoming a part of pop culture in a way that they never really seemed to care about that much previously, where they're focusing on similar sales tactics to something like Funko Pops or like, I don't know, Supreme or Shepherd Fairy, or these like sort of fad marketing ideas, right? This collector culture phenomenon, right? Same thing with like Beanie Babies or whatever. And these things have a tendency to balloon up and then the bubbles tend to pop. I don't think Magic has ever reached, I mean, it's pretty clear that they have never reached this level of sort of like cultural acceptance in this way. And it's almost like, it used to be that like you were a nerd for playing Magic, and now it's like you're a nerd, so therefore you have a commander deck, right? It's like a total different shift in how the game fits in someone's life. And I don't know if that's by and large, or if that's totally accepted by the player base, but there definitely is this almost like nerd cred, right, for having a Magic deck at this point. And I'm not trying to be like old man yelling at clouds and saying we need to go back. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying like I do think that these things tend to have this kind of life cycle, in that if you get too far down the rabbit hole of collector culture and you have created a speculative asset that suddenly people go, oh, this actually isn't worth anything. It's all, funny money. It's all Clarence bucks. Those things tend to blow up, right? Is that you have a bubble, it pops. And then if you've built your business on that bubble with the expectation that it continues, you have a huge problem.
That's the biggest concern, is not so much whether the bubble's going to pop, but whether Wizards is building its infrastructure off of this bubble existing. And and I'm sure they are, right? They're hiring out an insane amount. They're, paying way more to make these Universe Beyond sets than anything else. And it's huge deals that are taking them years to create. So it's not like if suddenly something were to go wrong, they could suddenly steer their ship a different direction, right? It would take a huge amount of effort and probably even more money to try and correct if, let's say, the market is not going in their favor anymore. The only thing that I think might be in their favor is that, as opposed to like Beanie Babies or these other sort of collector items, is that there's at least a usage. So even if the bubble pops, it probably has some sort of like a larger floor or a higher floor than something like Beanie Babies have, right? Where there's still going to be people that are interested in playing the game, even if, let's say, the Commander hype just completely plummets.
So I would agree with you. Like, I would agree with that, as long as the game maintains integrity, right? That's the sort of tightrope walk we're doing here, where we're literally talking about how, CEDH at its highest level is in strategic collapse, right? It's not a viable format at this point. People are trying to figure it out. We don't know if they're going to, right? And then so we know at its highest level that if that is what Magic is, it doesn't actually function as a game, right? In the way that it's promising that it does. So as long as Rule Zero, content creators, these things are propping up CEDH or propping up EDH, right, Commander, as this sort of casual format, and all the players are sort of agreeing amongst themselves that it's a casual format, everything's fine. But if the game in its totality enters strategic collapse, that bubble that we're talking about, that, like you're saying, these game pieces have value because they have utility in a game. So theoretically, they're worth something because people want to buy them for the game. If that becomes undermined, now it's just a bubble.
It's hard to say, right? Will it end up just becoming Pokemon, where I feel like Pokemon's sort of competitive viability is still there. There's still Pokemon tournaments, but it's definitely not its primary thing. I'm not a Pokemon player, so I could be wrong. Sorry, but it seems to me like the majority of cards in their sets are generally just sort of filler cards that are meant a lot more for collector purposes than for actual tournament competitive viability. As far as I don't think they have any sort of major draft formats or anything, so I don't think they're planning packs out in the same way that Magic does.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're starting to get into another topic a bit, but I will say that like Pokemon 2, their baseline cards for just playing the game are much less expensive than the collector's item ones. And
that's
again,
true.
That's that bubble I'm talking about, is that those two things have become detached, and Magic is like actively seeking to do that, right? They're like, here's serialized cards, here's special printings, here's all this special stuff. Ooh, cool, right? But it's like, well, none of that has any real value. This is all cardboard, guys. Like,
yeah, that stuff could definitely pop for sure.
Yeah.
Hard to say if it will. Chances are, as long as Magic still has any sort of interest, then it'll be fine.
All right. So what are our takeaways here? What are our hopes, dreams, aspirations?
So I think right now, like you said, we're kind of in uncharted territory in multiple ways. This is the first time that a free-for-all physical game has reached this level of popularity outside of poker. And it's the first time that a free-for-all game has reached this level of popularity with customizable pieces. So there's a lot for Wizards to figure out.
Yeah.
Right. There's all sorts of possible solutions for the future. If they end up feeling like they do need to rely on the competitive viability, it's possible that they can try and create some sort of a path to get Commander players to go into their other formats like Standard and Modern and bring interest to that. What I could see as potentially being a more likely route is trying to find some way of legitimize a 1v1 format using Commander decks. In that way, it's at least it's one less step to get Commander players interested in a competitive format that would be significantly easier for them to design around.
That is a pretty big pickle if they're trying to get players into these sort of competitive formats, right? Is that like the Commander decks and systems don't cross over, right? It's like Commander is its own ecosystem. And if you just have Commander stuff, you don't have 60 card stuff, right? There's not, instead of it being like, well, I have a 60 card deck that I can play in multiplayer, or I can play that 60 card deck in 1v1. The other thing I'll say is that in the same way that Commander sort of came in through this grassroots movement, right, when it was like players that were disenfranchised from what was happening, we're also seeing a similar thing start to emerge for 1v1 players. And they're creating a format called pre-modern, which is basically saying like, we like this format from back in the day, and we want to have an ecosystem that doesn't have new cards injected into it.
Oh, okay.
Pre-modern is up to the modern. It's everything up to the modern format.
Okay. They're pulling a Yu-Gi-Oh!
Change.
Then.
Yeah. Stuff like the Edison format, like you're saying,
right.
in Yu-Gi-Oh! So we'll see if that catches on, but I don't know if that will. It could just be that there's room here for something else entirely.
If you enjoyed listening to us complain about casual people playing our...
That's not.
If you also hate casual players...
Nope.
No?
No.
Running out of ideas.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about the rise of the casual players in Magic the Gathering, smash that subscribe button and press the like button. How do you do this? You do this every time.
I know, right? Also, you can join our Discord, unless you're a casual player.
Wow. Forrest is casual, by the way. So
yeah.
Sort of.
I'm not a casual. I made like a super hardcore Bumbleflower deck.
Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.
I made She-Ray with Shadowborn Apostles. There's nothing fucking casual about that. I play like 22 Shadowborn Apostles in that deck. I can play like 6 or 7 demons on turn 7. You think that's casual?